Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you. If you wouldn't mind, please put your audio on mute so that we don't have any feedback, okay? That would be great. Thanks so much for joining us today. So my name is Dr. Katie Lynch, and I'm the chair of the Sam Draper Honors Program at RCC, and I have the privilege today of introducing one of our most stellar alumni, one of my favorite people who I've met during my time working at RCC, Zuzu Tadashuk. And I am going to have an official introduction in just a moment, but I want to elaborate a little bit first on my relationship with Zuzu. So I met Zuzu when she decided to start attending Rockland Community College as a part-time student, and she was still modeling at that point. And when I met her, I knew she was special. I could tell that from the very first conversation. And over the years that we worked together, her writing and her thinking has taught me so much. And by the time she transferred to Wesleyan, I said to her, you know, we've reached the point at which I am no longer responding to your work as a professor. I am responding to your work as a colleague. And that is a really exciting moment for any teacher to reach with a student. And so I'm going to go ahead and officially introduce Zuzu now, but I'm so glad you all are here. This is going to be such a treat today. And so let's talk about Zuzu, who is, as I mentioned, an alum of the RCC Honors Program and a recent graduate of Wesleyan. While attending RCC, Zuzu worked as a full-time model. Her modeling career began when she was signed to Ford Models at the age of 16. She worked predominantly in high fashion, walking 60 or 70 runway shows during her 5-year career for brands like Chanel, Valentino, and Dior, as well as doing editorial work for magazines like Vogue and commercial work in catalogs. She retired from modeling in 2018 due to the struggle of maintaining health in a model body. After struggling with distorted body image and disordered eating throughout her career, Zuzu has turned to writing to understand the effects and after effects of modeling on her body and to share these experiences with others. Her senior thesis at Wesleyan was a memoir of her modeling career. Today, she will read a brief excerpt of this work, followed by a conversation with RCC professor Andrew Jacobs. And please do be advised that this reading will include some R-rated language. So thank you again for being here today. And Zuzu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katie. Oh my gosh. And thank you all so much for being here. It's so nice to see so many people and like friends and people I don't know, RCC students. It's really nice to have such a big room. That introduction was really nice. I am so happy to be here back at RCC. By way of context, I know we don't have that much time. We're trying to end at 11:50 today, and then we might continue sort of informally to have a conversation afterwards. I'm going to jump right into my reading, but I wanted to give a little more context for what I'm about to read, and just say that about 1 year into my career, I was sent home from a Paris Fashion Week for being too skinny to be on the catwalk. And I went home and was sort of like trying to like mend my relationship to food and gaining weight. And then 2 years after that, I was sent home from another fashion week for being too large to appear on the catwalk. And this was all while I was still sample size, basically. So the section that I will read from now explores the like really narrow margin for acceptable model bodies in the high fashion industry and how I navigated different types of model bodies. Once I was signed to a modeling agency, the first thing I had to do was figure out how to have a model body. The model body was my craft, yet its shape was a mystery to me when I began modeling and remained a mystery throughout my career. No one in the fashion industry talked about the model body. There was no guidebook to it. There was nowhere to look but to myself to give me what I really wanted, which was to turn myself into a successful item. And for me, at the start of my career, that meant being a true professional and losing as much weight as I could. I adopted a diet of half an apple for breakfast, half an apple for lunch, and cooked vegetables for dinner. Each day, I walked miles around my town and later, in warm weather, began swimming every day. Over the next 8 months, I steadily lost weight. A model friend of mine, who I will refer to as E, observed my progress, and wrote about it in a draft of her autobiography. She refers to me in her writing as Z, describing my appearance as follows. Quote, she was on the streets of Paris after my fitting for Chanel, but she wasn't Z anymore. The golden angel had shriveled, her legs, now like two sharp razor blades. Her eyes, the bright light that once beamed in them, had grayed. Her gold skin had turned sallow, a flat, dirty yellow. Her hair had lost its shine and volume. She'd lost at least 20 pounds, a true 00. And her mother stood there, beaming about how she was to do Chanel. What a selfish cunt, end quote. E blamed her mother for her eating disorder. So when she met me, blamed my mother for mine. But whereas E's mother was an ambitious model mother, and my mother never pushed me to pursue my career or entertained any illusions that my success was hers. But whereas E's mother was an ambitious model mother, my mother never pushed me to pursue my career. My mother's intervention in my body came in the form of the example she set with her own body and her own inherited beliefs about beauty. I saw lots of mothers' bodies in my career, trailing their daughters to castings around the world, and my mother's was the tallest and the thinnest of them all. She was my skinny double. By contrast, the quote, new faces who came from the Midwest with their stout, large-breasted mamas in tow just looked to me like model bodies with expiration dates on them, lucrative until they become mama. The model Amy Liu describes her fear of such a fate in her memoir, Solitaire, the compelling story of a young woman growing up in America and her triumph over anorexia. Liu describes the effects of anorexia on her body. Her breasts shrink, she stops getting her period, and she lives in fear that gaining weight will give her a matronly figure. She writes, quote, I grab my breasts, pinching them until they hurt. If only I could eliminate them, cut them off if need be, to become as flat-chested as a child again. It is better now than before I started dieting. To think that I needed a size B bra. Now I don't even need to wear one. But the womanly outline still remains, and I'm afraid that if I should gain, they'll blow up like zeppelins. I would probably start having periods again as well. I would probably look and function just like my mother, end quote. We were daughters first and foremost, trying to be or trying to forget our mamas, who had been our earliest and closest models of the one thing that as mannequins we were always modeling, femininity, which came before and after fashion. Fashion just gave femininity different styles, and to represent each of these, there existed a different ideal model body. I used up at least 2 model bodies in the course of my career. First, I was one of the might as well be boy girls, suited to high fashion editorial and runway work for edgier, more avant-garde audiences. Second, I became a more conventionally womanly model body, suited to commercial work with mainstream audiences. Each of these forms was rewarded differently. My first model body was that of a child, breastless. My agents understood this quickly, worked with it. They never bothered, when they had me visit the agency, to take bikini digitals of me, pictures that agents usually send out to keep clients abreast of the various shifts that occur on a model's body. Swimsuit and lingerie clients who never quite fell within my niche. My digitals were usually accomplished fully clothed. Was obfuscation my niche? It came as a surprise to my agents that Victoria's Secret asked to see me at the VS Fashion Show casting in 2015. It came as a shock to me that I went. I wrote in my journal of this casting, quote, I find for once that I'm less nervous than the girls around me, as I feel certain I have a -% chance of booking the show, while they still have excruciating room for hope, end quote. I was the only model to take a quickie from the table in the waiting area. I didn't book the show. In other contexts too, my skinniness consistently read as androgyny. In 2016, a stranger was moved to ask me on Instagram, quote, are you a boy? Then to pinpoint the source of their doubt in a second comment, quote, no breast, end quote. In 2017, a famous photographer remarked that I had the chest of an 11-year-old, reinforcing the thesis of James Kincaid's scholarly book, Erotic Innocence, that art photography set itself apart from amateur photography by becoming obsessed with the child and disinterested in, quote, children who've stopped being children, who misplaced childhood along about exactly at puberty, end quote. At which point he says, we dropped the camera. This was the way I spent much of my career, frozen in puberty. I didn't get my period until after I quit modeling. My second model body developed toward the end of my career. As my body grew softer and fuller, it served me less and less for runway work and more for e-commerce and catalog shoots, commercial jobs which carry less prestige in the fashion world. In other words, the more feminine my body grew, the more lowbrow it became within my industry. It lost some of its artistic value. Puberty, remember, is the point at which art photographers drop the camera, but its economic value increased. The irony of the fashion pay scale is that less elite gigs like jewelry advertisements tend to pay better than glamorous jobs like runway shows. Aware that my career was winding down, I cashed in by shooting a perfume commercial and a cosmetic campaign on my way out the door. The money I made from this second feminized model body allowed me to buy the house I currently live in. What astonishes me most in hindsight is that all the time that I was overdoing it in one direction or the other, growing too thin or too plump, no one who worked with me or who saw my work wondered if I was a fraud. All my model bodies passed as real models, which is to say they accentuated the patterns of white girls everywhere. Hilton Als wrote in an essay about one of his friends, quote, she was as conscious of her body as she was fearful of it. In short, she was a woman. Which fear and consciousness illustrate something Als wrote in another essay, quote, the idea that femininity as an idea does fuck you up, end quote. And that's the end of the section that I'm reading.
Thank you, Zuzu. That was really wonderful. I'll introduce myself. My name is Andrew Jacobs. I'm a professor in the Speech/Communication Studies department, and I also teach gender studies here at RCC. And I was very excited that Zuzu was a student of mine in one of my gender studies classes. So that's how we got to know one another and got to talk. And I just wanted to say, I just think that I haven't had a chance to finish the whole memoir yet, but I'm really enjoying not only this excerpt, but also the parts that I've really read. I just find it very well written. It's really well connected to the scholarly work in the field. I just find it very precise and very delicate. And I just want to congratulate you on a wonderful product.
Thank you, Andrew. So nice.
I also really love the language, as I said, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. I find that the language, again, is very precise. And so you really capture, I think, well, this idea of being alienated from your own body. And just a few of the phrases that you use as you talk about selling the image of your body, that you sold your model body, and that you refer to yourself as wanting to be a successful item. These are very objectified words, very removed from a kind of sense of personhood. And you never really speak of selling yourself you as a whole person, but only this external form. And in the case of selling your images of your body, you're not even talking about selling your body, you're talking about selling this image that's removed from that. So then you're at a kind of double remove from yourself in the sense of representation. And I'm curious if you would say more about this, like how did you develop this language?
Thank you, that's a really good question. Actually, yeah, I think the term model body, I was inspired in like, I guess, writing that by this writer who I quoted at the end of my section, Hilton Als, and he writes about, he writes an excerpt about Louise Brooke that's sort of like part of a short biography, and he talks about her having a dancer's body and then dropping out and becoming soft and white and undefended, and becoming like gaining a writer's body, which he says doesn't belong in a place like Hollywood where everyone's bodies are defended. which to me, like that description of the process of dropping out was really vivid because it felt like
Hello, where are you? What are you doing?
Oh, no, you want to, oh, wait, got you. It felt like very resonant with my experience of dropping out of the fashion world, in a sense of like, and also like inspired me just to think of like the effects of our different occupations on different bodies, and then also thinking about how like my body was my occupation, which is unique. That's the case for models. That's not the case for writers, and part of why writing was maybe so appealing because it really doesn't involve your body so much, unless you write about your body like I ended up doing. But yeah, that was part of how that came about.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you're quoting from Alls, you're talking about, who's a great New Yorker writer who likes to write a lot about these sorts of issues, fashion in particular. And you use the word armored, which is an interesting word to think about, because I think oftentimes when you imagine a model's body, you think of it as almost stripped down. I don't know, could you say a little bit more about, did you feel armored when you were preparing for a shoot or for
definitely. I think like part of like the process of like becoming a model body, if you think about it as like being in the dressing room, you're yourself or something, and then entering the catwalk, you're becoming a model body or something. And part of that process of like becoming a model is like stripping away your kind of like your personality or your like your you know, like you need to enter a kind of different zone to be able to like stand naked in a room of people with like photographers walking in and out of the room while you're getting dressed. You know, like you, like me as an individual would feel uncomfortable with that, but me as a model, you know, that is just the job. So it's like a sort of like, there is like a shift that happens in your relationship to your body where it does become an object to you, kind of you have to treat it as an object. Otherwise it would, I think, be a very like, you know, uncomfortable occupation in many ways.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, that it's both at the same time armor and stripped down in a way of being depersonalized, that's the armor, is the removal of your personhood.
Yeah, interesting. True.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's fascinating. Another question I wanted to ask is to talk a little bit about just the fact that I think all of us to some degree feel a pressure, even men, I think, to increasingly to model beauty in some way, right? We're all aware of this model that we're supposed to reach, and that we're all encouraged to treat our bodies as objects. But how is it different, the experience of being one of the models of beauty, different from everyday activity of modeling beauty? And you've sort of had experience in both realms.
Yeah, interesting. I think like it's true that it's something, you know, that like the pressure of ideals is something that everyone experiences. You don't have to be a model to have experience with like the impacts of society on your body. You just have to have a body. And like I think there is kind of an illusion that like models are the ideals or something, like you, like a model embodied is the ideal and like is what everyone wants to attain. It's like the huge image of a woman on a billboard that seems perfect. But I think like what I found is that models who I met in my career, and including myself, had the worst body image issues that of like anyone I've met outside of modeling, more intense than I've experienced anywhere else. And that I think like, you know, like models are not the ideal, like we're close to the ideal, but ideals are purely aspirational. They're places that nobody can inhabit. And yeah, I think like being close to it is also its own kind of like its own kind of I don't know, stress or something, because yeah, I don't know, the stakes are very high when you are one of the models of an ideal that you're not actually fully embodying yourself.
Yeah, so there's a kind of failure, I guess, in the sense of I mean, you can depersonalize yourself maybe at the moment of a shoot, but you're still yourself in this broader sense, right? That it's hard to separate your sense that this is a magic trick that you're performing rather than something that you still have to reach for, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, true, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And I'm curious, like, especially now that you're retired from modeling, when you look back on it, what is that experience like, when you're, not being that model? Is it, I think a lot of times when people do something, even that has a lot of negative elements to it, which clearly your experience did, there's a kind of, sometimes there's a little bit of a nostalgia for it, or there's a sense of not being able to pull yourself out of the orbit of that. And I'm curious how you feel about that experience.
Yeah, I think like I thought that leaving modeling would be just like purely liberating, and it hasn't. I like kind of expected that quitting would allow me to escape from certain forms of scrutiny of my body altogether, and certain forms of reading too. Like I felt like I felt like my body was always being read and like interpreted and judged or evaluated, and also, like I guess like evaluated in relation to like desire and femininity and things that I wasn't fully comfortable with, and I thought like quitting could be, to like I could escape that entirely, and of course that's not true. Like quitting just released me to different forms of the same looking, because we all are looked at and evaluated in relation to desire and gender and sexuality, and in relation to beauty ideals, we're still evaluated. I'm still evaluated based on my weight or something in different ways. And so I think it was disappointing, and also, an awakening to find out that like, yeah, I guess I was sort of naive to think that I could just like flick a switch. Yeah.
I think about somebody like Billie Eilish, who I think is clearly had a really interesting relationship to the representation of her body. I don't know if you're too familiar with her or other people in the room are, but she has traditionally worn very baggy clothing, and then recently did a kind of high fashion shoot, and then took a lot of criticism for that. And yeah, I think it's just another example, I think, of how it's very hard for women in particular, I think, to escape that, right? No matter what they do, they're coming in for some sort of criticism. Yeah. And so like, even if you're outside the profession, can you really escape that? And I think that's kind of tough to do at some level. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah. Another question I had, I was curious, you mentioned in the excerpt that you read, this idea of high fashion as being androgynous, right? That it's kind of both and, feminine and masculine, or neither is another way of thinking about androgyny. And a lot of times scholars have looked at that androgynous look, and they have different ways of interpreting it. And I'm curious what your feeling is about it. So oftentimes it's thought of as a more kind of girlish as opposed to womanly look. So that, if you look at a lot of runway models, as you're describing it, like if they're very flat chested, they look prepubescent, right? So they look like girls rather than full grown women. And so that's one interpretation. And others have said that really the aesthetic is about mirroring boyishness. And that particularly that image of women in that sort of prepubescent state is more akin to boys in an aesthetic that frequently appeals to photographers and fashion designers who, quite frankly, are often gay, and that might be part of the appeal of those images. And I was curious if you had thoughts about what's driving that. I mean, clearly, like in your work, you make reference to this idea of high fashion and high photography shooting this kind of girlish look, or this, but I wonder if you could expand maybe on your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think like the photographer who told me I had like the chest of an 11-year-old, or the excerpt from that former model who was writing about like wanting to like get rid of, like cut off her breasts. Like those to me like sound very much like trying to, I guess I've also read like feminist criticism of beauty ideals says that, things like the elimination of fat is the elimination of sexual difference, because it's like curves that make women womanly and matronly and like reproductive potential and all of, I don't know, just like it's so like a like a thin ideal as like a aspiration towards like a masculine body. And so I have thought a lot about that, and that would be like, I guess like a more boyish over girlish. But I do feel like, fashion wants women to look like girls and girls to look like boys. And I don't know if I have like a clear sense of why that is, or what's behind that, but it has been something I've thought a lot about.
Yeah. I mean, I think in my view, I think a lot of times it's a mix of those. I think that you don't have to choose. I think a lot of times we're kind of encouraged to have a particularly linear view that it's either one thing or the opposite. But I think oftentimes, particularly in anything you interpret, there's both going on, right? That you have these, these audiences that are very diverse, and that everybody can bring to these images of what they want. And it's interesting to think about that, like, again, coming back to this use of your word armor, that I think probably as you're doing the job and as you describe it, trying to be professional, that you're trying to achieve a sense of agency in this, right? And so on that level, you're trying to achieve an objective, and maybe that's a masculine form of power on some level, but at the same time, it can be a kind of stripping away in a way that is more feminine in nature. I'm curious of your experience. Have you had particular reactions, even maybe with particular photographers, that you felt like you were getting a particular vibe about how they were reading you or what they were pushing you toward in that sense? Like the photographer is obviously saying, is marveling at the fact that you're, without breasts.
Yeah, true. And I mean, and I think in that particular instance, he was like calming the set down because like my shirt was open and people were like, oh my God, like stop shooting. And he was like, no, it's nothing to worry about. Like there's nothing to see there, basically. Which was, of course, its own kind of like humiliation. But I guess like, I don't know, going back to how you just mentioned, like how it was like professional to lose weight, and what my motivation in that was, I don't really know. Like I just thought it was the thing I had to do, and no one actually told me to lose weight when I signed my contract for representation with Ford Models, and it was just like a thing I took upon myself to do, which backfired because then I got too skinny. But basically, like it was, like I said in my reading, it was like the model body is something that no one talked about, and especially not like agents.
Yeah. Although I think you mentioned, I think in another excerpt, that I read, that your agent did describe how little you needed to eat, right? That people don't really need to eat all this food, right? That there was some push in that direction. Yeah,
that's true. And and then and then she was very upset when I actually got too skinny, and I felt like it was not my fault, but of course, like she later had been telling me not to lose more weight, so, and I didn't listen to her, so then I kind of like thought I was the expert, so who knows why. And then was mad at her for like pushing me to lose weight when she had actually been since then telling me not to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess it gives her plausible deniability, right? If the industry doesn't actually, give you a particular metric, then they can't be blamed.
Yeah, true. Yeah, very true. Yeah, they were all sort of like, what happened? You used to be so beautiful.
Oh my goodness.
I was like,
I'm really interested in the fact that you talk about these sort of two model bodies that you inhabited over the course of your career. And so the one is we've mostly been talking about is this more elite androgynous look, and then the lowbrow, as you call it, model body, which is more plump and feminine. And I also think it's fascinating that you mentioned that actually the lowbrow work is the work that gets paid the most. And I wonder if you have thoughts about why that is. That seems kind of contradictory.
It definitely seems contradictory. It was very confusing to me and still confuses me. I don't like have an answer for it. I think like the lowbrow work is like appealing to a mass audience. It has mass appeal, and therefore there's more money in it. But it's not what people in the fashion industry like or value or find, exciting. And, so I guess like insider prestige within the industry does not go hand in hand with mass appeal. And there's money in mass appeal, but if you want prestige within the modeling world, you want to do you want to be on the cover of Dazed as opposed to like the cover of Harper's Bazaar, which people here would probably recognize Harper's Bazaar more if they went to a newsstand than they would Dazed or Love magazine or some of these more like obscure niche, like edgy, artsy fashion publications. But for like modeling prestige, you'd want the like more niche fashion exposure, but the money is of course in like the more popular stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And actually, yeah, and it's also interesting that stuff like, I mean, being in magazines doesn't pay anything. So like you could be on the cover of Vogue and you wouldn't be paid for that as a model. So the things that are like deemed more artistic and more prestigious, they don't require compensation in the same way. Like, oh, you should be so lucky to be on the cover of Vogue. And yeah, so I mean, you don't, when you're in a magazine, you don't make any money from that.
Yeah, and you were saying that when you described that, you used the phrase editorial work. Could you talk a little bit about what editorial work means in this context? Yeah,
editorial work is basically photos that go in a magazine along with it's a fashion story. So it's a spread in a magazine of photographs. And that work is not paid versus like advertising work. If you're shooting for a catalog, that is paid.
And do you think that attracts a different kind of model to that sort of work? I mean, obviously some people cycle into these different levels to some degree. And I don't know how common that is. I imagine certain bodies are more suited for some work than others generally.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't do any commercial work almost for like the first few years of my career, and I was doing mostly like runway stuff, and then towards the end of my career doing very little runway and doing more like catalog work. And I mean, I know models who have like really illustrious careers and are kind of like superstars within the fashion industry, but are like not making any money, but they're like so famous, but they're not making any money. And it's because they're in the like they're in like the market for prestige, not the market for like big rates, big day rates.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of fascinating. Yeah, and a lot of people have talked again about the overlap between how those different media that appeal to different groups also influence body shape too, right? That the plumpness and the more feminine element of commercial work is more mass appeal, and that some people have associated that in the scholarship to this idea that usually more working class images or middle class images, that standard of beauty within that group tends to be more curvy, whereas the elite images tend to be the more androgynous ones, which is kind of fascinating to think about that. Yeah. Did you feel like, even though you were making money when it came to the high fashion part, or you weren't making money there, but then you made money when you sort of sunk to the level of commercial work, did the money salve the pain?
Yeah, definitely. The money was really nice. And yeah, and sort of like it was at the end of my career, I was getting into a very lucrative market for my body and kind of couldn't do it anymore. So it was just unfortunate timing, or it was perfect timing. I couldn't stay. I was just so done with like having to monitor my body in certain ways, and at a certain point, like it wasn't worth continuing, or it wasn't worth putting myself in that position any longer.
Yeah. One other question I had was just, I think as somebody who teaches gender studies, I'm immersed in a lot of the same images that you're very familiar with and are the images of. And, I find that even when I'm immersed in these images, just even if only to critique them, it's very hard when you're seeing image after image not to fall under their spell in some ways. And, as somebody who has been even more immersed in this, I'm curious if you have ways of dealing with that sort of malignant but seductive pull of the images.
Yeah, that's a really good question. They're very hard to escape. And I think reading and writing for me has been the way to counteract the pull of ideal bodies and images and beauty ideals. And I think when I quit, I gained a lot of weight, and it was at first very painful for me, having been a very aesthetic object at one point, to feel like I'd sort of lapsed or failed in that way. And I think reading, I don't know, Susan Bordeaux's book Unbearable Weight, about feminist critiques of beauty ideals, was sort of my tool against it. I was no, this is, basically I'm freeing myself from this oppressive ideal. So it's good to be healthy and to be happy, and there's something political in that or something. And yeah, I don't know, I guess it's still alluring. I still find myself sometimes succumbing to the pull of ideals. But yeah, I think reading and writing is the way that I'm still, I guess, processing that.
Yeah, and I have to say, I really do find that your memoir is really very much in keeping with Bordeaux's work. That was the first author I thought of when I was reading it. I really feel like it follows in that tradition very nicely. Yeah, so
that makes me extremely happy to hear. I was still actually modeling when I read Susan Bordeaux's work for an independent study I was doing with Katie, actually writing about modeling. And I was still modeling, but it was in the last few months of my career, because I was getting more and more uncomfortable with it. And reading that book was one of the things that I was like, oh my God, I don't want to be part of this system. And that was a big step.
Yeah, I think what your work shares in common with hers is it's both very academic and scholarly and analytical, but it's also very personal. And I think there's a kind of ethos that you can see in both your writing and hers that I admire a lot.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right, I know at this point we wanted to also open things up just to questions from the audience as well. So if people would like to ask questions either out loud or put them in chat, we'd be happy to have.
And just to facilitate that, I know that Shoshana had wanted to ask a question, and I believe to unmute to do so. And there is a question also in the chat, Zuzu, about when your memoir will be published. And I think we would all love to know your thoughts on that as well, because I think we all agree that it should be.
I guess on that, I would love to publish it one day, and I don't know when, but I have writing to do, so that's the next step. Yeah, thank you.
Shoshana, did you want to unmute?
Yes, I didn't want to be rude anyway, so I wanted to wait until she was done answering that other person's question. Zuzu, I look up to you tremendously. I don't know if that makes you smile in any way possible, but I hope it does. I look up to you in many ways because I too want to join the beauty community and become a model myself, but I'm very scared, and I hear a lot of people telling me there's going to be a lot of industries that are going to judge literally every little thing about you, and they're just going to destroy your personality. And I wanted to ask you, was there ever a point in time where it was you would just break down and just not know what to do? Because I'm sure modeling meant something to you, obviously you wouldn't have done it for as long as you did, and you wouldn't have kept going as long as you have if it didn't mean something to you. But was there ever points where you would just come home from a shoot and just start breaking down and be oh my God, I don't know what to do. I mean, I care so much about this, but I don't know what to do. And it's just did you ever have those days?
Yeah, for sure, Shoshana, all the time. I I mean, it was like a constant struggle. I mean, it was a constant question for me whether I was going to, you know, continue or quit. And it was sort of something I evaluated like weekly. And, you know, calls from my agent to like, oh, you know, you like get on a plane and go to this next shoot would just like throw me into another like spasm of like, oh my God, I don't know if I can do this, if I want to do this. And you know, I just dragged out the decision for like 4 years, but I kind of wanted to quit as soon as I started. And the reason I stayed was not, I think not so much like caring about modeling itself. I felt kind of very ambiguous, I guess, like ambivalent about it, and was sort of, I think I was mostly there for like it as a job, the livelihood that it provided.
Right. I had one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is some advice you would give to like someone like me or like a newly model heading into the industry? What kind of advice would you give, and what would you kind of also warn about too?
Yeah, I think definitely like you have to have something that grounds you outside of the work. And for me, that was, you know, coming to RCC when I was sent home from Paris the second time for being overweight, and that was incredibly emotionally like crushing. I realized basically that I needed to have something else going on in my life other than like the whims of this industry, you know, something to like stabilize myself in my own interest, something I was doing just for myself. And school was that for me because I love school. And I think having something that you're doing for yourself outside of this job or outside of this industry that has nothing to do with it, that has completely different values, yeah, where you're building something else is good to have at the same time.
Right. Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to answer my questions.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Absolutely.
Would anyone else like to ask a question? You can jump in. You can use the reaction button to raise your hand.
I got a question in the chat from Sigourney. Does the growing inclusivity of what defines a model body, i.e. plus size models, give you hope for how the industry views the female body in general? And that's a really good question. And I think, yes, definitely. I think, I don't know, there was a recent Vogue cover that was a big deal. It was made a lot of because there was like different body types on the cover. And that's like a huge step. When I was in fashion working as a model, that didn't happen. And I think things are changing. And, you know, I'm not like so hopeful always. I mean, I'm still skeptical sometimes of like change as a performance. And I think like high fashion runways are still going to continue to be like predominantly populated by really thin white girls. And I don't know how quickly, you know, like fashion is like, you know, very entrenched in itself in certain ways. So yes, I think like I am hopeful. And I also think like, I don't know, just the whole business of display itself kind of like disgusts me, or not disgusts me, just like kind of like, I don't know, I'm not really, you know, excited about it in general.
And I see that Marin has a question. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Yes, thank you. Hey Zuzu, it's nice to, like, I'm also a former Ford model, and I think I saw you once or twice in the agency, so it's really nice to see you here and also like doing the gender studies. And I wanted to ask you if you have any reading recommendations, because lately I've been also like looking back on how that career has also shaped my understanding of my gender identity, and yeah, and I'm always like curious to hear about other former models who then look back, trying to make sense of that. If you have any book recommendations that help you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for some reason, I'm like blanking on most of the titles in my bookshelf, but I won't write them in the chat. But definitely like Susan Bordeaux's Unbearable Weight was like really big for me. There's an anthology that I think is called like Feminist Perspectives on Eating Disorders that is good. And I don't know, there's like certain like academic books about fashion, like Anne Hollander's Sex and Suits is sort of about like gender and dressing, which was, like, related to these questions for me. And I'll continue thinking because I'll put it in the chat. That's a really good question. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
And I see Noah has a question.
Yes, hi Zuzu. I wanted to ask actually, like, what would you do differently in the industry? Like, I don't know, like, let's say you had a modeling agency, what would you want to see done differently?
Gosh, I would, I think I would never have a modeling agency. I think just like the whole idea of like, I don't know, just the whole idea of looking certain ways is like just the whole idea of like trying to look like something, no matter what it is something that I was like trying to like resist when I quit modeling, which of course is impossible. You always look like something. You have a body and it's in the world and it's always going to be read as something or other. I guess like I would, I don't know, just try to, I don't know, like represent all bodies as they are and not pressure them to change, I guess. Yeah, it's a really good question, and hopefully I never wind up in that reality. Thank you, Ella, for the question though.
Of course, thanks for answering.
And Dr. Stern also has a question. Please go ahead.
Hey, hi, Zuzu. I hope you can hear. This isn't so much a question, just sort of a comment. I think is it Sigourney who made the comment about with the plus size models and having representation. So as someone who's going to be 57 years old and who, dealt with, back in the 70s, Brooke Shields and Cheryl Tiegs and all those models back then. One of the things, I just find like with age, like getting older is like really nice. You feel less pressured on those kinds of issues. And I actually find like, I'll read these dialogues about there should be more models who represent older people, older women. And I don't even want to see that. Like, I'd rather just, be away from me. I don't want to see images of Botoxed women and women who are 60, but who somehow are supposed to look like they're 40. Like, I just feel, especially with the Botox revolution and all this plastic surgery people get, it just seems to me that whole beauty issue has become more problematic. And even though I realize, and I've read Susan Bordeaux and I've read a whole bunch of the theorists on these beauty issues. Really the best thing is I think you just want to be as free from these images as possible. Because once they're in your mind, especially as a young kid, they poison you forever, basically. And you feel that kind of pressure. And I always thought, well, you get older, you don't feel it. But now with all the, with all the Botox and everything, it's like a new wave of pressure. And I just think the best thing is to just be away from it. So that's not really a question. It's just it's a personal comment and reaction as someone who struggled with this kind of thing, since as like I think all American women do. And in the 70s, it was pretty bad too, with the Brooke Shields and Cheryl Tiegs, and there were a whole bunch of models at that point, the Charlie's Angels phenomenon. And it's it's really a shame that so many people, that we all have to struggle with this. That's just my comment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stern. That's really interesting. And I kind of like, it makes me think about how like, representation is good and increasing representation is good, of course, but is like proliferating images necessarily the answer? Like, it just gives us more tools to use to measure ourselves by, or like more things to try to look like, or more things to try to like bend ourselves into the shape of. I don't know if if, yeah, basically that was the thought that I was having in response, but thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, and thank you, because this is wonderful, this talk. I really appreciate what you're sharing.
Thank you so much.
Oh, maybe I should say at this point that I think we're just at 11:50. So I know we do have at least one class that's here. So maybe we could pause for a minute if people need to leave because they're done when they have a new class coming up. We could do that. And I know that Zuzu has graciously agreed to stay on a little bit. So if people would like to just chat a little bit more, we can entertain some more questions. I've got a couple of questions myself that I've got in my back pocket as well. So we'll maybe pause for a minute and then we'll start again in a second.
And I do see Pascaline with a question when we're ready for that.
Yeah, might as well, I guess. People can just sign off and we can just keep going, right?
Go ahead, Pascaline.
Hi. So my question is, how do you feel comfortable before each modeling shoots that you have? Like, how do you feel like comfortable with yourself and overall in that environment, and without feeling pressured to look or act a certain way?
Wow. I think that kind of like is the question, because I mean, what you're dealing with is definitely pressure to look and act a certain way. So I don't know if I ever really figured that out. I kind of, I don't know, I always remained nervous throughout my career and uncomfortable before like a runway show. I got so nervous. I would be just like immensely, had like huge stage fright and I guess like, you know, afraid of looking the wrong way or not walking the right way or tripping, which is, you know, just a more like mundane fear. But yeah, I don't know. I think like, that's a really good question. And I actually I don't think I ever figured out how to feel comfortable before, like, you know, like putting your body before an audience.
Okay. And I have another follow-up question. So I'm sorry about the background noise. So if you were given a job to do and you didn't like, it wasn't something that you were personally, I guess, it's not something that's your personal belief or something that you don't really like. Do you try to confirm yourself to that, to just do the job, or do you kindly just reject it?
Like what kind of a belief do you?
Let me say if they had like this clothing that they wanted you to model for and you're like, that's not my style, I don't really like dressing like that. Do you just do it because you're a model, or do you just say, you know what, I think this person will be a better fit for it, and just kindly or politely decline?
That's a good question. I always took work. I didn't ever decline, and maybe sometimes it would have been a good thing to do. But yeah, I think I, you know, just like in terms of like speaking of how like the model body becomes like an object that doesn't really represent your personhood. If you're not, you know, seeing it as yourself doing it, it's just like your body being lent to this cause for a moment. It's easier to, I don't know, I didn't have trouble like modeling for things that I didn't, I guess, like feel represented by or agreed with necessarily.
Zuzu, could I answer that question?
Oh, sure.
I'm Zuzu's mother. And
Hi.
hi. So I was, of course, influential by Zuzu living with me when she was 16 years old. She was still under my guidance and watch. And so I think that to answer that a little more kind of on the peripheral, you know, just basic side, is that the agents were very good at figuring out what Zuzu could do and what she was able to do. I do remember forms coming in that said, do you do horseback riding? Or are you opposed to wearing fur? Which is a big thing because there are models who would walk off a shoot if there was real fur there. And so they try to figure that out all in advance. That's what I'm trying to say. So I don't think Zuzu, you know, she just trusted, and Zuzu did have a wonderful agent. She didn't have more than one, really. She had one main agent who really cared for her. and who thought long and hard, would this work for her?
Wow, that's amazing. So that kind of, I guess, made the process of choosing, of picking what project to work on easier, since you already knew her and knew what she was interested in. Thank you so
Yes,
much
and
for
what she was
answering my question.
capable of. Like Zuzu said, she was very shocked when she got a request to come try out for Victoria's Secret, which her body was never a Victoria, an angel body, put it that way. And that was quite a shock. And I remember her saying, you know, what? This is crazy. But she was able to go with kind of an understanding that, you know, it's good experience and it would be something to be able to write about, because once again, writing was a major component to Zuzu's structuring herself to be able to cope with this. And she kept a blog throughout the entire 4 years, which is no longer up, but it was amazing. And it was her way of processing all the crap she went through.
Wow. Wow.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Mom.
much for sharing this. This has been amazing and inspirational.
Thank you so much, Pascaline.
Do we have any other questions?
Maybe while we're waiting, so I really want to encourage other people to ask questions, but maybe I'll just jump in and ask another one just while people are thinking of what to ask. And I think Zuzu, I know you've sort of gone back and forth about this maybe a little bit, but I know that in the memoir itself, there aren't any pictures. And when you first sort of described what you wanted to do for the presentation, there weren't pictures involved. And then I know at one point you were thinking, oh, maybe I will include some pictures of your work, but you didn't. And I'm kind of curious what you think about that as at least a provisional editorial decision. So maybe you'll change your mind for the future. But tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's mostly I just haven't like delved into the immense archive of images I have of my body from modeling, and I think it's it's a daunting and big task, and sometimes I like go and like look through my downloads and like try to find a picture, but it like there's so many pictures that like they could tell a whole story of themselves, I feel like, in terms of like even like visually like representing how my body changed over the years or something. It's just been like too much to take on so far, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think another sort of broader issue is, I know within visual communication studies, there's a kind of increasing sense that oftentimes when you have a narrative in words, that images often work at cross purposes to that narrative, which I think is kind of an interesting idea. And particularly in cinema studies, that's something that is a kind of important concept. And so, you know, I think to me, it relates to this idea of, you know, here you're presenting a story where you're describing an experience which describes some things that you're very critical of about the modeling industry. But then if you present the pictures, it almost acts as an enticement to the industry in that way. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Wow, yeah, no, I never really thought about that, but that's fascinating to think of the images acting at cross purposes with the writing. That makes a lot of sense as an enticement. Huh?
Yeah. Do you feel comfortable with having done it without the images? Do you feel like your main purpose, the main reason so far you've omitted the images or not selected is just, oh, it's just too overwhelming to think about what to select in the first place? Or do you feel like there's a strength to the words on its own?
I guess I haven't really thought about it enough. I don't know if I have like an intellectual reason to not have images. I know that if I were like reading it, I would like probably immediately Google myself if I were not myself, to like look at pictures of like, just to know like what we're talking about in terms of like what kind of modeling is this. So I think like maybe in terms of like just like having some visual context, it would be nice to include images.
Useful. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, one last thing I'd say about that is I think Dr. Stern is one of my heroes, and I really loved her comments about trying to stay away from images, particularly images of women her age, which I think is kind of interesting. Like that here you're getting somebody who's got a very decided opinion to avoid imagery in this way. And I think that's an interesting editorial choice everybody can make or not make. But it's true, I think everybody, even if we're not presented with images in a presentational context, Google is always just your phone away.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
But let me go on and see if there's other people who have questions. So anybody else want to?
Looks like you do have one more question.
Ashley?
Hi, Zuzu.
Hey, Ashley.
Just wondering, like, how do you feel about your body now? And like, how do you think this like made you feel? Like, I don't know how to say it. Like, having to go through that experience, how does that make you feel about yourself now? And like, how did that like evolve your feelings about yourself?
That's an awesome question. And thank you so much for coming, Ashley. So I'm so happy you're here. I think like it's been a process. Like I feel fine about my body now. For a long time after I quit and like gained weight, it was like I felt not good about my body and it was very uncomfortable for me. And I sort of had to like disconnect myself entirely from it and think like it's just a thing and it's doing what it needs to do. And it's like, like, I don't know, kind of like expanding and like finding its shape after this like kind of like tight and compressed period of my life. And I just have to let it do what it's going to do. And like, I'm just going to like ignore it and not try to look good. And for a long time, that's been like my approach to my body, like not try to look like anything, not try to like dress up or look nice or anything, because it was just like too uncomfortable after like having been a very, I guess, like successful. After having been very successful at looking good, it was hard. It felt like not worth it to try to look good if I couldn't look amazing, if I would just look like mundane and like normal or like not special. It didn't feel worth it. And like, of course, like there's all sorts of problems with that view, but I think like more and more I'm starting to like be able to like see that I can like use my body again or like be in it again and like trust it to, I don't know. I'm feeling better. I'm feeling better about my body. Nice. Thanks for the question.
Zuzu, I have a question.
Yes, Nikolai.
It's me. I know that there's people here listening right now that are like considering modeling and are looking to like pursue a career in that or have a career in that. And I just know that in my experience of seeing you go through this experience, seeing other friends go through modeling and their struggles, and then also like brushing into modeling in my own small way, I just have gained such a bad taste for it and stuff, where like I hear people going into it and it like scares me because I want to be like, no, like don't. And I wonder like what your feelings are on that, and especially when it's something where it can make you so much money or it can be like a good successful job. Like how do you balance the like, is it worth it for the money for what you've left the industry with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For a long time for me, it was worth it for the money. That was the simple fact. And then after a certain point, it wasn't, because it was too much for me or something. It became like too painful, I guess. But I think like there are models who go for years, who have like, like really long careers, who, like reach their 30s, which is old for models, with like continuous success. And I always wonder like where they get their stamina from. And, for some people, I guess, it must be easier than I found it. And maybe I'm just not like predisposed to being looked at or to liking to like be displayed or something. which made it difficult. I don't know. Some people I think do better in it than others, and yeah, is it worth it? For me, of course it was. Like I'm still happy I did it and had this experience, and yeah, I think it's not for everyone, and you just have to feel it out, you know.
Would you recommend it?
Probably not. Probably not. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
I have a question, if it's all right.
Yeah, Teresa.
Hi. I apologize for coming in a little bit late, so I'm not sure if you covered this, but given the fact that you are now coming out the other end with all of your insight and whatnot, as having gone through everything that you went through, would you ever take on a role of, I don't know, a consultant or something in that nature for other models that are in the industry that may be going through similar things, even working for a modeling agency to help the young models? Would you ever consider that? Is that a real job? Are there people like that who help the models with body image and other issues that they might be going through?
That's a awesome idea. I've never heard of that position or seen it. I think it would have been really nice when I was a model. I ended up talking about body image issues wasn't a thing that was really discussed, at least when I was a model or in the circles that I was in. I ended up talking about it with my fellow model friends, on our own social time, and it being something that we weren't always sure the other person experienced until we brought it up, and we're so test the waters, and then the other person would be like, oh my God, I struggle with this so much, and then it'd be like, whoa. And Andrew brought up to me in conversation the other day this term, what was it, some pluralized ignorance, or is that it, or what was it?
Yeah, plural ignorance. Yeah.
Which do you want to explain, Andrew?
Yeah, so the idea of pluralistic ignorance is that oftentimes we all experience something, but we feel like we're the only ones, right? So we're all sitting here in this room and we're all thinking something, but you think, oh, I'm the only one thinking it. And then but if you did a secret poll, you discover we're all thinking that, as that idea of pluralistic ignorance.
Yeah, and I've never heard that until recently, but that very much describes the experience of being a model and all models struggling with this, or maybe not all, but many models struggling with this, and not just not talking about it, or not knowing that we're all dealing with it. And yeah, so I guess back to your question, Teresa, it would be very useful, and I don't know if I would consider that, but I think the idea of the position is a really good one, and maybe something should happen with that. Thank you.
You also have a question in the chat from Rebecca, which is, were you able to make the progress you have in accepting your body and eating normally only through reading and writing and discussion with the people you're close with, or did you need to seek outside help from a professional?
That's a good question. I never did seek outside help from a professional, and yeah, I don't know how my progress would have looked different if I had. So that's, yeah, I did it, I guess, in-house, but not necessarily saying that's the right thing to do or the best thing. Cool. Well.
Oh, maybe I'll ask one last question. Then, if anybody else has more, we can continue with that. I know that that earlier in the memoir, not from the segment that you read, that you have this great line where you say, as a white girl enthralled to the fashion world, like most white girls, I was encouraged to see myself promised in all of fashion's ideals. And I love that line. And I also love the fact, particularly that you're recognizing your kind of position as a white girl, right? And so there's whiteness involved as well as other things. And I'm curious, you know, what you thought about maybe model friends of color. What was their experience like? Or if you could say more about like what whiteness means in the context of modeling.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think like I don't know what the experience was like for my model friends of color. I think like we didn't talk about it that much, and I think like of course must have been different, and also like we were dealing with some of like all the basic similar just like elements of like being a body is scrutinized, and that scrutiny must be different, you know, in different ways that I can't imagine. I think I remember a show that I was in for Oscar de la Renta where my friend Luisana, who's Black, was like, her hair was left natural and my hair was straightened for the show. And I have like kind of curly hair, and I noticed then looking around that like all the models of color had their hair left natural and all the white girls had their hair straightened to like a pin straightness, which to me just seemed like a weird choice to like racialize us by our hair or something. And I don't know, it was very mystifying to me. It seemed like the only guiding principle in that decision was the race of the models that they were dressing.
Yeah, that's really interesting that and I like the word that you're using, racialization, right? So that oftentimes you think about race as something that's imposed on people rather than something they are, and is what that term means. And so this idea that you're naturally white, in quotes, by having straight hair. And so we straighten your hair to make you look more like you're supposed to look. And then Black people have to have what's so-called natural hair, right? That's just curly hair in order to do that. And did you find that was mostly the way? I mean, maybe there were runway shoots that were more integrated in terms of race, and maybe did that accentuate, you think, that sort of racialization? Or do you think it was more at the whim of the individual designer? Or?
I think it was definitely like designer by designer. And I mean, also there, like the other side of that is that like fashion can also homogenize like its objects. Like people, sometimes for runway shows, everyone would have like their hair like dyed and plastered, and all plastered in the same way to their head with like bleached eyebrows or something. And then like, you know, we're all kind of like made, you know, identical as much as possible based on, based on some like desire to have like this army of like weird androgynous bodies or something to represent a certain look or a certain show.
Yeah, I know there's like an expression that oftentimes high fashion is about creating a hanger for the clothes rather than, you know, accentuating a particular person's, you know, individuality. It sounds like that's your experience.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, Rivki.
Wait, I can't hear you.
We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you, unfortunately. No, I'm sorry. Do you want to try putting it in the chat? And I'd be happy to read it for you. And while Rivki does that, are there any other questions for Zuzu?
While she's doing that, Zuzu, besides high fashion runway modeling, did you do any other modeling catalogs and I don't know, other things?
Yeah, I did do catalogs. I did do some like campaigns for like jewelry and perfume, and I what else? I did like magazine editorial work, which is in like magazines.
Was there a difference in, I don't know, how you felt with doing the different types of modeling?
Not really. It was all kind of, it was all very much still like within the same, I don't know, like market or something. Like I wasn't like doing vastly different kinds of, I was still working with all the same people, and like and all the models in my like echelon, or like whatever you want to call it, like in my peer group, we're all doing the same jobs as well. We're all working for the same clients. So it was still like within a certain like in group or something.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And it looks like we have a question from Ananda. Hi, Zuzu. I was wondering what you thought about the role that models have in the perpetuation and the capitalization of these unrealistic body images. Do you think that they can have part go the responsibility or the capacity to change the culture? And Ananda's pointing out that you are part of this change already.
Wow, that's very nice. Do I think that models can have a part in change, have the capacity to change the culture? Yeah, for sure. I guess they also definitely do have a role in perpetuating, like, you know, harmful standards for beauty. And I guess like increased representation of different body types for sure has the power to change, you know, what kind of images we fantasize about, and what kind of, you know, bodies we can imagine as beautiful and as wanting for ourselves. So yes, I think for sure. Thank you for that question.
Oh, maybe I'll suggest a hack here. So Rivki, I don't know if you want to, do you want to just give me, no, you're not going to worry about it. No, okay.
I see Talina's hand.
Hi, Zuzu. Yeah, I had a question. So my first question is, I know that there's a lot of talk about how like models are very competitive, I guess. Is that true in the industry, that it's a very like competitive?
Not really, actually. I found like most models who I worked with were very sweet and very nice, and like I'd never felt competition really with them. Although, you know, you are like up for jobs against your friends or in competition with your friends technically, but between us it was never like a backstabbing environment or jealous environment.
Okay, that's actually awesome. I was hoping to hear that. It sounds nice. Thank you.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. All right, Rivka.
So Rivki's question is, while most of us go through developing our genders and gender expression during our formative years, you were in a sense made to perform gender, playing with images of femininity and masculinity. Do you think that harmed your development of such expression or formed it in any way?
Rivka, man, okay, here we are. That's a very good question, and you it's too much. I don't really know the answer. I think like, did it harm my affirmation of my gender in any way? No. I think like it changed my gender in many ways. I think like after I think basically like post modeling, I found like that like dressing in like typically like feminine or girly clothing was very uncomfortable, just because of the way my body was changing, and for me, I like assumed a more like masculine wardrobe after that, because of like a feeling of a need to like conceal my body, and so I don't know if like if it was so much like a gender desire or like just like an impulse to hide or to wear baggy clothes, and how to distinguish like aesthetic desires from gender desires, really. Where does one end and the other begin, I guess. So Yeah, thank you for that question.
It looks like Maren has another question.
Yeah, sorry, another question. I
No,
was
it's wonderful.
wondering what type of reactions you got from people outside of the industry regarding you working with your body, and also regarding working with that comments also on your model body, whether there was a change in how you were perceived and how your body was perceived and commented on. Yeah, what kind of reactions that yeah,
outside of the industry?
Yeah.
Huh. I didn't really feel like my body was so like commented on outside of the industry. It was sort of, or I guess after quitting, it surely was. I think when I gained a lot of weight after I left modeling, then it was commented on by, you know, like family members and friends who I think were confused by how it was changing. And I think that was hard for me because I felt like I left modeling in order to avoid scrutiny or evaluation of my body, and it continued, you know, interpersonally in terms of like, you know, friends and family in my life, and that did exist, and I think, yeah, that's like the only experience I really have outside of the fashion world with so much, yeah, being commented on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And Elvin.
Hi, Zuzu.
Hey, Elvin.
Hey, Zuzu, I was just wondering, I don't know if you could answer this, but do you know if male models encounter kind of similar issues that you have in the modeling world?
That's a good question. I'm not totally sure. I know there's like more like gym pressure for them than like starvation pressure, like diet pressure. And I know that like, yeah, male models there's been like a bunch of stories recently about like sexual assault in terms of like being bad for male models, and which makes sense. Like that would happen in the fashion industry makes sense because, like Andrew was saying, it is such a place for like gay men in power, and that like male models would be targeted, you know. I guess, yeah, it makes sense. And yeah, and that doesn't really answer your question about like pressure on their bodies, but yeah, I'm sure they have, you know, their own forms of you know, uncomfortable standards that are sometimes hard to meet. Thank you for your question, and thank you.
Thank you, Zuzu. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen.